5:47 a.m., Kodiak Island, Alaska. August 15, 2026. The floatplane dock sat quiet in the early gray light, mist hanging low over the water. Surveillance footage captured from a concealed position across the inlet shows a man in a worn canvas jacket moving along the left engine cowling of a de Havilland Beaver, working through his pre-flight check with the practiced routine of someone who had done this several hundred times. A thermal imaging camera mounted in the surveillance van across the water tracked his heat signature in the cold morning air. The fishing clients were due at 6:30. He had 40 minutes. He never heard the vehicles. The marshals had cut their engines 200 yards out and rolled in without lights. 6 federal agents moved from 3 directions simultaneously. 2 from the tree line to the north, 2 along the dock approach, and 2 through the hangar itself. They wore tactical vests over civilian outerwear. No markings visible from a distance. The arrest was complete in under 90 seconds. No weapon drawn, no resistance offered. The man they took into custody had been living on Kodiak Island for 11 months. He had been running a 2-plane charter operation. His clients knew him as a reliable, cash-friendly pilot who asked few questions and kept irregular hours. His neighbors knew him as quiet, self-sufficient, and fond of early mornings. The US Marshals Service knew him as a fugitive, a former 12-year veteran of the Federal Air Marshal Service who had vanished 14 months earlier, leaving behind a badge in a bus locker, a stripped vehicle in a Nevada parking lot, and a sealed federal indictment carrying 16 counts. The hunt had crossed 9 states, burned through dozens of leads, and consumed thousands of investigative hours. The break that ended it did not come from a tip, or a surveillance camera, or a border-crossing database. It came from a single paper medical form filed with the Federal Aviation Administration under a name that did not exist 3 years ago. The body camera footage from the arrest tells the clearest part of the story. A suspect on the ground, federal agents standing over him, the dock and the Beaver visible behind them. What took years of surveillance, financial forensics, and a fugitive task force to unravel was not the disappearance itself. Plenty of people run. What was rare, and what the evidence collection scene made plain, was how carefully and methodically he had rebuilt, and how close he came to never being found at all. His name in the indictment was Raymond Castiglione, 12 years with the Federal Air Marshal Service. Based out of Los Angeles International, internal evaluations described him as consistently competent, no disciplinary flags, moderate performance reviews. The kind of agent who does not stand out, which in federal service is often considered an asset. According to the indictment, unsealed in June 2025, Castiglione had been selling information for approximately 4 years. Not classified intelligence, nothing that would trigger a counterintelligence alert. What he sold was operational, jump seat manifests, internal documents showing which flights had air marshal coverage and which did not, weapon storage codes for secure compartments at certain regional airports. The kind of information that, in the wrong hands, could help someone move contraband through commercial aviation channels with immeasurably reduced risk of interdiction. The buyer, according to federal prosecutors, was a contract broker operating out of the Los Angeles basin with documented cartel-adjacent associations. The arrangement was transactional, no ideology, no coercion on record. Castiglione made a calculation according to the indictment, and the calculation held for 4 years, estimated criminal proceeds, $1.9 million. The investigation that would eventually catch him began not with Castiglione at all, but with an anomaly in cargo screening data at a regional airport in Southern California. A DOJ Office of Inspector General analyst flagged a statistical pattern. Certain flight routes showed a consistent gap in air marshal presence that correlated with cargo shipments flagged in a separate DEA investigation. The gap was too regular to be random scheduling. Someone with access to coverage schedules was providing advance information. The OIG opened a source investigation. That investigation took 14 months to work backward to Castiglione through financial forensics, communication metadata, and ultimately a confidential source. By early April 2025, investigators had enough for a grand jury proceeding and a scheduled interview with Castiglione through proper OIG channels. He did not appear. 3 days after the missed interview, a bag was found in a bus terminal locker in Bakersfield, California. Inside, a Federal Air Marshal badge and credentials set. No other contents. The locker had been rented in cash 8 days earlier. Surveillance footage from the terminal showed a figure in a hooded jacket. The footage was insufficient for identification. His personal vehicle, a gray sedan registered in his name, was recovered in a parking garage in Reno, Nevada. The rear seats had been removed. The trunk liner was missing. The vehicle had been wiped. His phone, wallet, and service weapon were not recovered. They have not been recovered as of the date of this production. The sealed indictment was filed in early April 2025 and carried 14 counts of unlawful disclosure and 2 counts of receipt of unlawful compensation. When the indictment was unsealed 2 months later, the US Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force already had a national warrant and a working file with leads across multiple states. The field running the case was a joint task force, primary jurisdiction with the Marshals, with investigative support from the FBI and coordination with OIG. The task force worked the problem from two directions simultaneously: financial forensics to trace where the money went, and field investigation to trace where Castiglione went. The financial forensics pulled up through evidence collection yielded a layered structure agents laid out across the table in photographs and printouts. Over 4 years, $1.9 million had moved through cryptocurrency wallets, prepaid instruments, and cash-friendly businesses documented in transaction records photographed at the evidence collection scene. Increments kept small, deliberately below reporting thresholds. Some portion converted into physical assets found during the raid. Agents working through the surveillance monitor wall in the operations center could trace the money. What the records did not contain was a current address. I spent time going through the early case timeline, and one detail kept standing out. The task force's first major lead pointed south. A tip from a confidential informant placed Castiglione near the Nogales border crossing between Arizona and Mexico in late April 2025. The lead was credible enough to deploy assets. Agents worked it for 6 weeks, coordinating with CBP and Mexican federal contacts. The trail did not produce a confirmed sighting. By June 2025, that line of investigation had gone cold. Every instinct in fugitive work points toward the border. Someone with resources and a reason to disappear heads for jurisdictional complexity. Cross into Mexico, then move further. It is the predictable play. Castiglione did not go south. He went north. He went as far north as you can go while remaining on domestic soil and still operating within an infrastructure that accepted his skills. Kodiak Island sits in the Gulf of Alaska, accessible primarily by air and ferry, with a permanent population of roughly 6,000 people and a substantial fishing and charter aviation industry. It is, by practical geography, 300 miles from the nearest federal courthouse and several degrees removed from the kind of surveillance density that characterizes the lower 48. He arrived on Kodiak, according to the investigation, in August 2025. He had spent approximately 4 months in transit, moving through at least 3 states by reconstructed digital and financial traces. He had built a new legal identity through a process prosecutors describe as methodical, a foundation identity document obtained through fraud, followed by a cascade of legitimate documents built on that foundation. A name, a birth record, a state driver's license from Alaska. The name he used was not recovered in pre-arrest investigation. It appears in the indictment as a redacted field. For purposes of this account, the name is withheld. Under that name, he had built a functioning charter operation. Investigators reviewing recovered documentation found FAA Part 135 paperwork, airman medical certificates, and logged flight hours, the kind of paper trail that takes years and deliberate effort to construct. Surveillance footage from the Regional Aviation Authority office shows a man matching his description at the counter, filing renewal forms. 2 aircraft were registered to the business, a de Havilland Beaver on floats, and a Cessna 185 on amphibious gear, cash-preferred clients, fishing lodges, hunting outfitters. The business looked, on paper and on the dock, entirely legitimate. The airman medical certificate is where he made his error, and the error is almost elegant in its smallness. FAA airman medical certificates require periodic renewal. The interval depends on certificate class and the airman's age. At some point in the summer of 2026, Castiglione's certificate under his new identity came up for renewal. He filed the renewal paperwork with an aviation medical examiner in Alaska, as required. The form went into FAA databases as routine. An investigator working the Castiglione file on the task force had, months earlier, entered a standing data query across multiple federal databases. Look for any new identity document filings that matched a specific profile. Commercial pilot rating, seaplane endorsement, age range consistent with Castiglione's birth year, FAA medical history consistent with his known pre-service flight training, which was documented in federal employment records. The query returned a hit in late June 2026. The name was new, the pilot history was not. The seaplane rating was consistent with flight logs from Castiglione's personal aviation record, which predated his federal service. The query flag went to the task force lead. The lead sent the renewal form for forensic document examination. Most people assume identity fraud collapses on the documents themselves. The evidence tells a different story. Modern document fraud is sophisticated enough that the paper often holds. What collapses is the person, behavioral patterns, skill sets, habits of movement that persist through identity changes because they are not about identity, they are about who someone actually is. A forensic document examiner with the FBI's Question Documents Unit compared the handwriting on the FAA medical renewal form against a baseline of Castiglione's known handwriting from pre-service employment records and federal service documentation. The examination took 4 days. The conclusion was a positive match with a high degree of examiner confidence. 4 days. 14 months of investigative work, cold leads, and dead ends resolved by 4 days of handwriting analysis against a form filed in routine bureaucratic compliance. The task force now had a probable location: Kodiak Island, a likely identity, an operational pattern built around a specific aviation business at a specific dock facility. What they did not have yet was confirmation that the subject was still present, had not been tipped, and would be at a predictable location at a predictable time. Surveillance asset deployment to Kodiak presented logistical constraints. The island's small population and relatively tight community made conventional ground surveillance high risk for detection. The task force made a calculated decision, compressed the confirmation window, and moved directly to the takedown rather than risk extended pre-arrest surveillance that might spook the subject. Here is where we'll say what most won't. That decision carried real risk. If Castiglione had sensed anything unusual, a single unusual vehicle, an unfamiliar face in a community that small, he would have been airborne before the arrest team was in position. The task force made a judgment call. In this case, it was the right one. But the margin was tighter than the clean outcome suggests. Charter flight records, obtained through the FAA under the new identity's registration, showed a scheduled departure for Saturday morning, August 15, 2026 at 6:30. A fishing charter, 2 clients, a lodge drop, a return flight in the afternoon. The arrest team staged out of Anchorage the night before. 6 marshals. They flew into Kodiak on a commercial turboprop in the early hours, arriving before 4 a.m. They had the dock facility under loose observation by 5 a.m. At 5:47, a motion-triggered camera on a utility pole near the dock approach showed the subject walking from a vehicle toward the aircraft. The test ran at 5:52. What strikes me about this case is the clarity of the behavioral trap. Castiglione was a pilot. He had been a pilot before he was a federal agent. When he built his new life, he built it around flying because that was what he knew, and what he knew made him economically viable at the margin of the road system. But that skill set had a paper trail. The FAA medical renewal was not a mistake in the sense of carelessness. It was a structural inevitability. He needed to fly commercially. Flying commercially requires currency. Currency requires documentation. Documentation leaves records. The system that caught him was not surveillance cameras or informants or border databases. It was paperwork. Federal paperwork that he had to file to do the one thing he was good at. He was walked from the dock to a waiting vehicle in leg irons. He asked one thing of the arresting agents: that someone secure the Beaver properly before it was left unattended. The request was noted, and the aircraft was secured. It was later seized as a potentially crime-facilitated asset under federal civil forfeiture proceedings. His processing was completed at the federal detention facility in Anchorage. He was transported to the Southern District of California, where the original indictment was filed, within 72 hours. The transport was unremarkable. He did not speak extensively to agents during the trip. Would you have noticed the signs before it was too late? If you lived on Kodiak and hired a charter pilot who paid cash for fuel, filed his paperwork on time, and showed up when he said he would, the answer is almost certainly no. The operational security was, in most respects, very good. What broke it was not human error in the conventional sense. It was the friction between a fugitive's need to generate income and the regulatory architecture of the industry he chose. The indictment, as filed and now proceeding, carries 16 counts. Sentencing guidelines for the disclosure counts alone, under the relevant statutes, carry substantial exposure. Prosecutors have not filed additional charges related to the identity fraud at this time, though legal analysts familiar with the case describe additional counts as possible. The $1.9 million in criminal proceeds has been partially traced. Asset recovery proceedings have identified several $100,000 in traceable assets, including the 2 aircraft and a small real property interest discovered during post-arrest financial investigation. The majority of the $1.9 million has not been recovered. Investigators describe the remaining gap as significant and note that the layered payment architecture makes full recovery unlikely. The contract broker in Los Angeles who served as the alleged buyer intermediary was separately indicted in 2025 and is in ongoing proceedings. His case is not directly addressed in Castiglione's indictment. The question of whether additional federal employees were identified through the same OIG investigation that surfaced Castiglione has not been answered in any public filing. There is a line in the indictment's background section that reads almost like a footnote but is worth sitting with. The defendant's disclosures resulted in a quantifiable reduction in detection probability on affected routes during the disclosure period. The indictment does not specify what moved through those routes during that window. That question remains open. Comment below with what you think should happen to federal employees who monetize operational security information, standard sentencing guidelines, or enhanced prosecution as a deterrent. The gap between those two positions says something about how we weigh institutional trust against proportionality. The US Marshals task force closed the warrant. The charter business on Kodiak has suspended operations pending asset forfeiture resolution. The clients who had a fishing trip booked for August 15 found a note on the dock office door, placed there by a deputy, advising that the charter operator was no longer available. One piece of this case the evidence collection did not resolve, why Kodiak specifically. Agents reviewing surveillance records and financial documents laid out across the operations table found no prior address, no known contact on the island, no wire transfer pointing there. Investigators working the radar tracking display and the phone toll records had the destination confirmed after the fact, the floatplane logged there, the arrest scene documented by body camera, but the original decision, whatever pointed him toward that island rather than any other, has not surfaced in the records made public. Subscribe so you do not miss the follow-up. Investigators are still working this case, and when new footage or records surface, we will cover it. The network the OIG investigation mapped has been partially disrupted. Castiglione is in custody. The broker is in proceedings. But the OIG report, as summarized in materials available through federal court filings, identified the vulnerability that enabled the scheme, a gap in cross-checking internal access logs against financial disclosures for personnel with certain clearance levels. That gap existed for years before the Castiglione case surfaced it. Surveillance records reviewed in this production do not show a final confirmed intercept. The operation remains open, the cargo still moves. The routes still exist. The oversight architecture that failed to catch a 4-year scheme before it ran its course is still the same architecture, with modifications the agency has not made public. The warrant is closed. The question the warrant cannot close is how much moved through the window he opened, and whether anyone else is still standing at a similar door.